The neighborhood had always been described as peaceful, the kind of suburban street where nothing ever seemed out of place. Perfect lawns stretched along both sides, and most of the residents valued silence as much as privacy. On the surface, it was the kind of place where children could ride their bikes and families could leave their doors unlocked. Yet beneath the calm exterior were eyes that watched and judgments that lingered. At the center of it all was Officer Richard Hale, a man who seemed to embody both respect and fear. Richard had lived on the street longer than most of his neighbors. He was a veteran police officer with a reputation for toughness, the sort of man who never smiled without reason. In public, he was polite but distant, always quick to remind others of his authority. For years, people had whispered about his temper, about the way he handled calls involving people of color, and about the bitterness that seemed to define him. But whispers never turned into action, because in uniform, Richard appeared untouchable. The badge on his chest served as both shield and weapon, and few dared to question it. His home was a reflection of his personality, clean, orderly, and closed off. The blinds were almost always drawn, the yard trimmed but never inviting. Even his wife, Claire, moved like a shadow within the house, rarely seen and never heard. To outsiders, it was just another family living a structured, quiet life. To those who looked closer, it was a fortress, built on control and silence. The rhythm of the street changed when Maya Johnson moved in next door. She was 23, full of ambition and unafraid of the future. Maya had grown up in the city, surrounded by energy and noise, and the quiet of the suburb felt like an opportunity to focus on her studies. She carried herself with a confidence that stood out against the subdued tones of the neighborhood. Her laughter carried across the lawns, her music sometimes slipped through open windows, and her presence was a reminder that life could still feel young and hopeful. At first, she was greeted politely but cautiously. Neighbors nodded from a distance, offering forced smiles, never stepping closer. For some, her age made her seem out of place among the older families. For others, her skin color stood out in a community where diversity was scarce. Richard watched her the way he watched everyone, carefully, critically, but with something extra he couldn't quite disguise. To him, Maya was both a curiosity and a disruption. In those first weeks, Maya paid little attention to the man next door. She had no reason to. To her, he was just another middle-aged homeowner, another stiff figure behind drawn blinds. She was too focused on settling into her new routine, balancing her classes and part-time work, and enjoying the freedom of her own space. But in a neighborhood where every movement was observed, it was impossible not to be noticed. Richard's gaze lingered longer than it should have, and his interest in her life grew quietly in the shadows. The street remained calm, the lawns remained perfect, and the houses remained silent. But beneath the surface, something dangerous had already begun to take shape. What looked like just another suburban chapter was about to unfold into a story that would expose secrets darker than anyone imagined. Richard had spent most of his adult life building walls around himself, the kind that kept people at a distance while maintaining the illusion of respectability. Yet the more he observed Maya, the harder it became to hold those walls intact. She was young, independent, and carried a kind of energy that unsettled him. It started innocently enough, a passing glance while she carried groceries, a moment of idle curiosity when she chatted with a delivery driver. But curiosity turned into fixation, and fixation soon became desire. The first contact between them was small, almost forgettable. Richard offered to help her with her car one afternoon when it refused to start. He played the role of the helpful neighbor, his uniformed authority bleeding into his gestures even when he was off duty. Maya thanked him politely, appreciative of the assistance but thought little of it at the time. For Richard, however, that moment planted a seed. It gave him an opening, and he was not the type to let such openings slip away. Soon he found reasons to cross paths with her. Checking on her safety, offering advice about the neighborhood, leaving subtle hints that he was someone she could rely on. Richard was careful, never making a move too obvious, but always positioning himself close enough to be noticed. Maya, for her part, felt both cautious and intrigued. He was older, stern, and carried himself with an air of command that contrasted sharply with the men her age. She knew the risk of getting involved with someone like him, especially a married man. But the tension carried its own appeal. Their relationship began in shadows, carved out of stolen hours and unspoken agreements. Richard never spoke of his wife, and Maya never asked. It was a secret built on silence, each encounter deepening their reliance on one another. For Maya, it was an escape, something thrilling and dangerous that pushed against the boundaries of her otherwise structured life. For Richard, it was more than escape, it was possession. He felt a twisted sense of control, as though Maya's willingness to be with him validated his authority in ways his badge no longer could. The secrecy fueled their connection. They met behind drawn curtains, under the cover of night, in places where eyes could not follow. Richard knew he was gambling with everything, his marriage, his career, his reputation. Yet the danger only pulled him in further. Each secret meeting convinced him that he could balance both lives, that he was untouchable. He had survived scrutiny before, and he believed he could survive it again, but cracks were already forming. Neighbors began to notice Maya's car parked for long stretches outside his home when his wife was away. A passing glance lingered too long, a shadow moved where it shouldn't, and suspicion brewed silently among those who watched from behind their curtains. Richard ignored the risks, dismissing them as nothing more than nosy eyes. His arrogance blinded him to the reality that secrets never stayed buried for long. For Maya, the thrill began to shift into unease. The excitement of secrecy was intoxicating, but Richard's intensity grew heavier with each meeting. What began as a rush now felt like a trap tightening around her, one she didn't yet know how to escape. Their affair was no longer a spark hidden in the dark. It was a fire that sooner or later would burn out of control. Maya's instincts told her something was wrong long before she found the proof. At first it was subtle, the way Richard's mood shifted without warning, how his anger flared at the smallest sign of independence from her. He had a way of looking at her that felt less like affection and more like ownership. When she pulled away even slightly, he grew restless, pressing her with questions, demanding reassurance. What had started as a secret thrill was quickly turning into something suffocating. One evening, while Richard was distracted in another room, Maya noticed his laptop left open. Curiosity mixed with unease pushed her to look. What she found unsettled her to the core. Hidden among routine emails and police files were threads of conversations on forums she had never heard of before. They were filled with angry rants, crude slurs, and messages soaked in resentment toward people who looked like her. He wasn't just a man with a short temper. He was someone who nurtured hatred in private, someone who lived in two worlds. The Richard she had allowed into her life was not just flawed. He was dangerous. The more she uncovered, the more her fear grew. There were photos from his time on duty that looked wrong, images of suspects beaten, moments of violence that seemed excessive, preserved like trophies. There were also notes, half-written rants, and even references to neighbors he despised. Maya realized she wasn't an exception to his hate, but rather a contradiction to it. The affair wasn't proof of affection. It was part of something darker, perhaps even an extension of his obsession with control and power. Terrified, Maya began to plan her way out. She confided in a close friend, leaving fragments of her discoveries through text messages and quiet conversations. She hinted at the double life Richard lived and the fear she carried, though she never revealed everything. A part of her believed she could quietly slip away, end things before they escalated further, but she underestimated how closely Richard was watching her. He could sense her hesitation, her attempts to pull back, and he grew increasingly agitated. Richard's paranoia sharpened. He became more controlling, asking where she was at all times, checking on her without warning, and reminding her of the risks of exposing him. His words carried veiled threats disguised as concern. To Maya, it was a warning. If she chose to leave, there would be consequences. She began to feel trapped, as though every choice led to danger. What she didn't know was that Richard was already piecing together her attempts to confide in someone. Her movements, her messages, even her silences spoke volumes to him. In his mind, she wasn't just a lover drifting away. She was a liability that could destroy him. The secrets he had buried for decades were now resting in the hands of a young woman he could no longer control. The mask Richard wore for so long was slipping, and Maya had seen enough of what lay beneath to understand the threat she was facing. She wasn't just caught in an affair anymore. She was caught in a web of lies, violence, and obsession, with no clear way out. The heat of summer lingered late into the evening, pressing down on the quiet neighborhood like a heavy blanket. Most of the homes were dark, curtains drawn, air conditioners humming in the background. Yet inside Richard Hale's house, tension was building. For days he had felt Maya slipping further away. Her texts had become shorter, her visits less frequent, her tone colder. Richard's instincts, sharpened from years of suspicion on the job, told him the truth. She was preparing to leave him, and worse, she might expose everything she knew. That night, the silence of the house was broken by sharp voices. Neighbors later recalled muffled shouting, though none could make out the words. Some assumed it was the officer and his wife. Others dismissed it as a television left too loud. Inside, Maya stood her ground. She had finally decided to cut ties, no longer willing to play the role of a secret in Richard's double life. But Richard couldn't accept it. To him, her departure wasn't just rejection, it was betrayal, a threat to the identity he fought so hard to protect. The argument spiraled quickly. Richard's anger, already a constant shadow in his life, erupted without restraint. The man who demanded control in every situation found himself facing the one thing he couldn't dominate, Maya's choice to leave. His rage turned physical. Furniture shifted, something crashed, and the sound of a struggle filled the room. Outside, a dog barked in response, then silence returned as suddenly as it had been broken. Hours later, Richard's car was seen leaving the driveway, headlights cutting through the still night. He drove aimlessly at first, his hands clenched tight around the wheel, the reality of what he had done settling over him. Maya's lifeless body lay in the trunk, wrapped hastily, stripped of the belongings that might link her to him. He told himself this was necessary, that she had forced his hand, that no one would ever find out. But even in those moments of denial, sweat clung to his skin, and his breath came in shallow bursts. The wooded area where he finally stopped was remote, a place he knew from patrols years before. It was the kind of place where no one went at night, where the trees grew so thick the moonlight barely touched the ground. There, under the cover of darkness, he dragged Maya's body into the underbrush. He worked quickly but not carefully. Soil clung to his hands, leaves tangled in his clothes, and the silence of the forest only amplified the pounding of his heart. When he was done, he returned to his car and drove back toward the suburbs, convinced he had buried the evidence of his crime. By morning, however, his control had already begun to slip. Investigators traced security footage showing his car near the wooded road. Forensic teams would later uncover fibers, traces of blood, and the missing belongings that tied everything back to him. What Richard believed to be his perfect cover-up was riddled with mistakes, each one unraveling the careful mask he had worn for years. The neighborhood woke to shocking news. Maya Johnson was gone, her disappearance already raising questions no one wanted to ask aloud. Richard, back in uniform, moved through his day as though nothing had happened, but the weight of his secret clung to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. The night that was meant to silence her had only set the stage for his downfall. The arrest of Richard Hale shattered the illusion of safety that had cloaked the neighborhood for decades. For many, it was unthinkable that the man they had saluted in uniform, the officer who had patrolled their streets and projected authority, was capable of such violence. But the evidence was undeniable. Investigators pieced together the timeline with precision. The late-night drive caught on surveillance cameras, the fibers in his trunk that matched Maya's clothing, and the fragments of soil on his boots that matched the wooded clearing where her body had been found. Each detail chipped away at the image Richard had built, until only the truth remained. The trial became a spectacle that reached far beyond the quiet suburb. Journalists filled the courthouse steps each morning, and television crews reported every development as though the case were a national scandal. Inside the courtroom, Richard sat stone-faced, his once polished uniform replaced by a prison jumpsuit. He carried himself with the same rigid posture as before, but without the badge, he was just another man stripped of power. His lawyers painted Maya as reckless, insinuating that she had pursued him, that the relationship was mutual, and that her death was a tragic accident, not a crime. But Maya's voice had not been silenced completely. The notes she left behind, the text to her friend, and the evidence she had quietly gathered were presented to the jury. Her words told a story of fear and entrapment, of a young woman who had uncovered a darker side of the man she thought she knew. The prosecution emphasized the hatred Richard carried, exposing his hidden messages and the disturbing files on his computer. The portrait that emerged was not of a decorated officer, but of a man consumed by obsession, violence, and prejudice. Witnesses described the sounds of struggle on the night of her death. Experts explained how the injuries on Maya's body told a story of rage rather than accident. And when the jury saw the photographs of the wooded clearing, the reality became undeniable. The picture was clear. Maya had not simply disappeared. She had been silenced by the very man who was supposed to uphold the law. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Richard Hale was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For some, the sentence felt like justice. For others, it was a hollow victory, because no punishment could restore the life that had been taken. The community, once defined by its quiet streets and manicured lawns, was now marked by the memory of betrayal. In the years that followed, Maya's story was retold in documentaries, articles, and vigils. Her name became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in silence, truth could emerge. Richard's legacy, once tied to his badge, was reduced to a cautionary tale of obsession and hatred. The mask he had worn for so long was gone, and what remained was a man exposed for what he truly was, a predator hiding behind authority, undone by his own darkness.